letting me be here. I'm sorry to not be able to hear Leslie's talk, but I'm honored to be here and honored by the award. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about data sharing in psychology from my own perspective, some challenges and some opportunities. And I think you'll see many similar themes from Ida's talk, though from a pure science perspective, there are both fewer risks in terms of medical and privacy issues and fewer stakeholders, mostly just researchers. So you could see this if you were a meta scientist as a simpler case study in some ways. Okay, so just to orient you to my own research program, I'm a domain scientist who studies language acquisition from a developmental psychology perspective. And my work uses kind of simplified situations like vocabulary acquisition, the learning that the word dog refers to stuffed dog toys and maybe also real dogs, but not stuffed pigs. So this is the kind of experimental and observational research that I do. And most of my research program has been around creating quantitative theories of this kind of learning. So using statistical models to try to capture the dynamics of children's learning. Just to be kind of explicit about what this looks like, we have a learning model, which is some kind of computational artifact that can take in input data and then make predictions about some outcomes. And this instantiates some scientific hypothesis about learning that folks are interested in. So we get a bunch of predictors. And in the case of the 2008 paper that I mentioned, that was one of the papers from my dissertation, this was 20 minutes worth of annotated videos of kids playing with their parents. And I used the outcomes of the learning model to try to predict a handful of binary experimental results, like children do a particular behavior, p less than 0.05, or to reproduce general descriptions of average developmental changes that have been measured with kind of small populations of children in convenience samples. So as I moved to Stanford and tried to scale this research program up and try to create more sophisticated and realistic models, I essentially ran out of data. And around the same time, I was starting to get educated about some of the challenges of reproducibility and replicability in psychology. So let me just highlight these terms, just make sure that folks are on the same page about them. Reproducibility is what's typically, it's called when you can run the same sort of analysis or the same code on a data set that's already been provided to you and you get the same result. So you call that a reproducible result. A replicable result is one where you can gather new data and run the same analysis or the same code and get some version of the same result. So these are, I think, prerequisites for the kind of theory evaluation that I was trying to do. If the data that you're trying to predict to are not reproducible or replicable, well, then you're on a fool's errand trying to bend your theory around a data point that is, should not constrain your theory. And of course, these aren't the eventual goal. The eventual goal is to create generalizable research that can predict outcomes, meaningful outcomes across a wide range of populations with new data sets and new analyses and so forth. But reproducibility and replicability are, in some sense, the minimum floor. A data point may not be interesting or generalizable, but if it's not reproducible and replicable, then you're nowhere from the perspective of theory construction. And I was beginning, as I went through this journey, to get kind of worried about these issues, in part because of the emerging meta-scientific data. So actually, when Maya took the first iteration of my class on reproducibility and replicability at Stanford, she contributed to a large-scale replication project, which is the first of its type in psychology, the Open Science Collaborations 2015 paper, replicating 100 effects from high-profile journals in psychology. This is now one entry in a much larger meta-science enterprise that's summarized in this review paper. It's a slightly complex figure, so let me walk you through it. What's being plotted here is the original effect size of the papers, and the vertical axis is the replication effect size scaled by the original. So a 0 is the same effect. So what you see in all but the last of these studies, the last is a different type of study, is this negative trend, such that if you had a larger effect in the original, you tend to see a diminution of that effect in the replication. So replication effect sizes tend to be on average about half as big. And this Protzko et al. Study is a kind of prospective study that tried to minimize some challenges to replicability and apparently succeeds because they see smaller effects but no diminution. And then critically, some proportion of these studies then are deemed replication failures by a p less than 0.05 or another criterion. And that proportion in the literature is about at least a third, and some studies considerably more, like a half, or even in the original 2/3. So this started to get us worried about bending our theories around individual data points because there was a really pretty decent chance that they might not be replicable. In other words, that neither the predictors, which maybe were obviously too small in magnitude, nor the outcomes were really appropriate for testing our hypotheses. And that was a real worry for me. So I started to come to the conviction that quantitative theory evaluation required both more and better data, and hit on an data aggregation strategy where I would do secondary analysis of previously collected observational and experimental data sets as a way to meet this need. And the model I began with, I like to call the Field of Dreams model. This is where I began my journey into data sharing. If anybody has seen the classic 1989 Kevin Costner film, Field of Dreams, this is a movie about Kevin Costner's character who lives in Iowa. He's a farmer and he's about to lose his farm. And he has this idea that comes to him in a dream. If he builds a baseball diamond in the middle of his Iowa cornfield, people will come there to watch games and he'll be able to get the money to save his farm. And in fact, the ghosts of old baseball players will come and inhabit this, this diamond. So I began data sharing with this model. If you build it, they will come. That's the mantra of the movie. That if you build a compelling interface for data sharing, our baseball diamond in this analogy, maybe strained analogy, then researchers are going to dust off their files, come to you and deposit them in your repositories. They're going to drive out to that Iowa cornfield and enjoy the baseball that or theory construction that ensues. And I think there's something to this. I maintain some idealism about the process of data sharing, but I also have recognized some challenges. And so the theses of this talk that I want to share here are that data sharing mandates to try to encourage folks to attend this baseball game are a start, but they're certainly not enough. And that we require something more than generic repositories for data sets. Rather, domain-specific data repositories need to store the data about theoretically relevant constructs to make them easier for reuse. And these repositories, in turn, can slowly create incentives to change data sharing processes and cultures in the field. So let me briefly illustrate each of these points. The first point about mandates I want to illustrate with a study to which Maya actually contributed. This study was led by Tom Hardwick, who was a postdoc in the Meta Research Innovation Center here. And it took advantage of a mandatory open data policy at the journal Cognition, which is a top journal for psychology and cognitive science. This is a first systematic case study of analytic reproducibility in psychology. So we took advantage of this policy being implemented by doing an interrupted time series design. Here's what actually happened. So what I'm plotting is the proportion of manuscripts with a data availability statement before and after the policy implementation. So this was an annotation study where we downloaded these papers, and a team of annotators coded whether there was a data availability statement. And you see indeed some evidence for an interrupted time series. There was a significant change in these availability statements, albeit with some implementation window. Pre-policy, we actually went in and downloaded these data sets and looked to see if they had all the data and sufficient metadata to reuse them. The reusability was pretty low, and that did jump up after the policy, but over a third of the shared data sets in the post-policy period were classified as not reusable. There just weren't enough data, they weren't documented, so that you could figure out what fields were and so forth. Maybe more troublingly, we in this study and one subsequent follow-up, we actually downloaded the data sets and identified statistical results in the manuscripts for analytic reproduction. We then went in at the cost of about somewhere between 5 and 25 hours per paper and coded up these analyses from scratch. So we ended up with about 60 across these two efforts, 60 reproduction efforts. And about a third of these succeeded completely. That is, we could get all of the numbers in the original paper without contacting the authors. Once we reached out to the authors, we made it up to about 2/3 of the papers where we could get the original numbers, all of the original numbers from a paragraph in the results that we were reproducing. But in the remaining 30-odd percent, 38%, we actually found that we could not get those numbers, and the authors could not help us get those numbers. That is, we couldn't identify the data and computation that would lead to a particular reported result in the paper. And this was very troubling for me. So just mandating data sharing is not sufficient. In addition, the challenge that I faced was that I did not want just to have some data. I wanted to be able to use these data for specific theoretical goals, evaluating computational theories that link children's language input and language exposure to their outcomes. And so simply browsing Figshare or OSF or Dataverse, while these are wonderful resources, they simply don't provide data sets with the kind of structure that would allow them to be reused in this way. Luckily, we actually have a wonderful model for data sharing in the child language field in developmental psychology. In fact, since well before big data was a catchphrase anywhere, the child language data exchange system, as part of TalkBank, led by Brian McWhinney, has archived essentially all of the extant data in this subfield, millions of words of talk to children and by children in a database. So this is the original big data for child language, and it's a huge inspiration for creating what I call domain-specific data repositories, shared research environments that are organized around a specific scientific construct, not just around the premise of data sharing, but around sharing the kind of data that advances theory. So inspired by this, my research program has really sought to build the kinds of repositories that can actually connect up with models of children's language learning. Capturing input predictors, basically the ChildishDB repository that I told you about. So what talk do children hear? What's their input? Capturing the outcome of how children do in experiments through meta-analysis and openly available meta-analyses. And then their learning outcomes, including their kind of global outcomes in language learning through a repository called Wordbank. I'll just mention each of these in turn. ChildishDB is a repository that we created. This is led by Alessandra Sanchez and Stefan Malin, and they created this repository in order to provide a reproducible versioned interface to the ChildishDB dataset, which is a wonderful data set, but it can't be accessed programmatically and isn't versioned. It gets updated in a kind of an ad hoc way. So this creates a fully reproducible interface where somebody can specify their data prep of this broader corpus of data and then allow that to inform their reporting about what was done. Second repository, led by Christina Bergman and others, is Metalab. This is an open site for archiving meta-analyses and making their data accessible as an evaluation endpoint, for example, for computational theories. I want to highlight about Metalab that when you go out and just scrape the literature for meta-analyses, although it's very common in biomedicine, it's actually less common in psychology to get these meta-analyses out there in the literature. And so we actually really have had to work pretty hard to find meta-analytic data sets. We're now up to about 30 meta-analyses, but that's after kind of 5-6 years worth of work. One mechanism that we found very effective here is small cash prizes for contributions to Metalab. So we say, whoever gives us the meta-analysis with the most rows in the Metalab format for import into this data set gets $1,000. So these kinds of challenges have really actually motivated a lot of early career researchers to plan their meta-analyses around a sharing goal. And I think that's really changed some of the culture around this and led to some growth for our data set. The last repository I want to mention is our repository Wordbank, which archives data from a specific instrument, clinical and psychological instrument called the MacArthur CDI. It's a vocabulary report form for parents. And we've now gathered a wide variety of these CDI forms from many languages and cultures around the world, basically parasitic on the work that researchers do to collect data in their own context. And this repository and populating with data has really been a very interesting experience for me about the slowly shifting international culture of data sharing. To get the ASL data here, the American Sign Language data, I picked up the paper forms from somebody's driveway in the East Bay who had done this study for their dissertation and wanted nothing more to do with it. For Hebrew, a sabbatical visit to Stanford by one of the researchers helped convince her to contribute to this repository. My own trip to Paris in 2017 resulted in the acquisition of French language data. And a family trip to Korea helped convince the Korean team to contribute their data to the repository. So really, instead of the field of dreams model here, what we had was kind of a gradually growing set of relationships, credibility for the repository, and a kind of broader gradual acceptance in the field that data sharing was part of making a data set prominent and accessible to other researchers. In fact, that it would give value to others by being part of the repository. So this is just a short slice of my personal journey through the data sharing landscape, which has convinced me that although I still hold on to the idealism of field of dreams, that there's some other kind of policies and cultural shifts that are necessary to advance these goals. Data are key drivers of theory development. I hope everybody agrees on that. Thank you, Zach. Yes, that's exactly the moral of the story. The data outreach, and you have to send my cute kids with me to try to help convince the developmental psychologists to hand over their data. No, that's not actually the moral of the story, but I do encourage more travel. Okay, so mandates, data sharing mandates can help, and I think it remains to be seen how the NIH policy gets implemented and how it trickles down in psychology and other areas. But I think community-based change is a really important part of this process. So in particular, domain-specific data repositories that can catalyze community standards and gradually support the processes of data and knowledge aggregation to support theory building and slowly change our norms. Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. That was wonderful. Let's take just one question, and then anything else can be saved for later, including the panel discussion. So one that's in the chat from Francis: I really like the idea of these specialized databases, specialized repositories, but where/how do you vet these resources? Can the funders direct? Should they?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. That's a really great question, and it's something that I'm asking as we start to try to generalize our work. You know, the first time we built one of these databases, there were a lot of decisions we had to make that we made in a kind of ad hoc way, and then as we've built, I think now 4 of these things, some generalizations have started to occur to us, and it started to feel like, well, maybe we could articulate a set of best practices, or maybe a checklist that a domain-specific data repository would have to pass in order to be marked as, say, a fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable domain-specific data repository, and to be an approved place for data to live. So I think developing such a standard would be really useful, along with developing the kind of technical tools, the package that would allow you to deploy such a repository for your construct of interest. So that's definitely something that we're moving towards. Maybe in discussion we can hear some of the others' perspectives on this from the clinical trials perspective, and of course also from the perspective of the neuroscience repositories that Russ has worked on.